And thus far, right, so that we ended up building 2 housing units for every additional person in 1985. And the magic number on this one is 0.39. 0.39 units per additional population. Because if you work that out the other way, that's 2.82 people per housing unit in growth every year, which is the average. For the permitting data only goes back to 80, unfortunately. And if you average out the, if you take the number of units per person for the last 34 years that are added every year, number of people that are added every year, number of permitted units, it ends up being 2.82 people per unit, which also happens to be the Harris County median household size.
If I can ask a quick question.
Yes, sir.
When you talk about a unit, are you talking about an apartment unit? And
Yeah,
a
housing unit.
So an apartment unit in a high-rise building would be a unit?
Yes, sir. Okay. One of 300, and then, or however many. Yes, sir. Okay. And so then we can see this relates here. So this is, the blue line here is new units per new pop in every year. Okay. And so then on the far left side, starting in 80, right, we can see here where the population growth started to fall, and the permitting numbers did not. And then in 86 and 87, we actually lost, I think it was 10,000 population and 8,000 population, and added about 10,000 units over those years too. So that number, so these should actually be infinite. I had to set them at 5, but the ones that go up off the screen. And so then we see this drastic change with the fall off in population growth and the number of units. And then if you look at the modern era, you can see the housing boom, right, before the financial recession. And then you can see where finance dried up. And that even though it used to continue to grow by 100, 150,000 people per year, we weren't permitting much more than, I think it was about 20,000 units. This year, right, we're on line to put about 61,000 units. And if we just put our same population growth as last year, 137, then we have 0.5 or 0.45 units per population. And we'll come back to that. And so then this just reiterates everything I just said. And so then the final in 86 was when the oil price hit. And that's really what killed Houston, or put the final nail in the coffin. And Saudi Arabia, USSR, and North Sea oil all started coming online in the mid-80s, which is what finally dropped the oil price from the 40 that it had stabilized out at to the 10. Right? And then put us down to the count and it took me on. Right. And so that the primary change that I'm going to focus on this time, so that we had the same type of crisis, we had a financial crisis which halted us in our tracks for a little while, but we responded. And that the primary change for this time period instead of the 80s is our technological revolution in the upstream. And the shale and horizontal drilling has been leading to an increase in American output of oil and light oil and natural gas, and then something else that we call condensate, which is not fun. And it did, and we increased our output, and we've moved to producing the natural gas and condensate and extremely light oil. And this is actually what's driving the midstream and downstream segments of the economy. All our new pipelines and chemical plants are being driven by the new output from our upstream. But our rig count has been stable, and so it's no longer just a direct driver of the continuing boom. Another big difference between now and the 80s is that in the 80s, oil and gas and derivatives were accounted for about 70% of the Houston market. Today it's not as low as we'd like it in order to have a more stable economy, but now it's down to 50%. And the oil there to the upstream accounts for a smaller percentage of that smaller percentage. And the upstream is the one that is part of the segment of the market that is most volatile. And so then we've been having, so what is causing all these changes? driving all these changes in the oil and gas and derivatives industries, which is then driving our recent boom, is this new technological change, right? Which essentially is this, what you hear about in the news all the time with horizontal drilling and fracking, and being able to get the shale oil. And so that you have these flat fields now that we have to drill through sideways instead of just poking the straw straight down into the hole. And then all of this is trapped in rock, and so then you have to use fracking to bust open the rock. And so none of this was acceptable, or truly accessible. We've known it was there forever, but it hasn't been accessible until George Mitchell in the early 2000s. Right? And it started with gas, and then with the bust, the financial bust, it switched over to oil. But this is driving our changes in the midstream market because it's brought about new fields and increased production from older fields. And so then here we can talk about Eagle Ford. Did not really exist as an oil field until about 7 years ago. And so there was no pipeline capacity to bring those liquids and those natural gases to the local markets, which are going to be Corpus Christi and us here in Houston. And then downstream, because now we're able to access a lot of that natural gas here in the U.S. and North America, and then also, we can talk about it later, condensate and extremely light crudes. And then this new access to these light crudes and natural gas are driving construction of plants to capture the low prices for their inputs here in the United States and primarily in Houston. And so then I'll take a little pause here and talk about my underlying model of what I actually think is going on here in the U.S., in Houston. So on the top side, you have your typical business cycle, right? And so then if you put in a sine wave, right, it looks like a business cycle, and then our red line is the trend, which is over the time periods that I have data for, about 2% a year is your typical trend line for Houston. And then what happens when you add some kind of technological change is you get this new trend line that you're going to end up on. And so right now the question is, what happens in between them? How fast do you grow? How fast do you shift right here between the old trend line and the new trend line? All right? But all it really represents is a shift up and a one-time shift. And so that's what I believe is happening here, is we've had this one-time technological change in the oil and gas markets that is causing all of this new investment today because it's worthwhile now, all right? But over some time frame, and that's the question, over what time frame, all right, we're eventually going to go back to our old trend rate of growth. So our economy will be bigger than it was or was going to be, but we're going to go back to the other 2%, right? Which, along the lines, when it sounds like I'm saying something bad or bad news, right? 2% of growth yearly is pretty good, right? And so then whenever I sound like I'm saying something negative, actually, most of the time all I'm really saying is talking about we're going to shift back from our current rate of growth, which is 4%, back to some trend, which, since it's been 2% for all the rest of history that I have, right, might as well say it's 2%. We might get lucky and it ends up being 3, but 2% is still good. Right? So most of the time when it sounds like I'm telling you something that sounds like bad news, all I'm really saying is that we're going to go from an awesome growth rate of about 4 or 5% like we've had for the last 4 years to back to a normal growth rate, which is still better than pretty much every other metropolitan area in the United States. Okay. So what's been happening in the upstream market? So with fracking and the shale oil revolution, the biggest change in the upstream market has actually been this historical separation of prices between oil and natural gas. So these are both regularized back in 97, and so we can see that they pretty much matched each other. Oil is blue, natural gas is red. They pretty much matched each other all the way up until, what is that, 2009. Right? When oil goes up, gas goes up, and vice versa. And then starting in 2009, or 2008 actually, so with the financial recession, right, we see that oil and gas prices both collapsed, and then gas prices stayed down, whereas oil prices recovered. This has never happened within our data set, where we've seen such a persistent separation between prices. And that is because when we drill these holes now and we're looking for oil, we're getting a lot of natural gas too. Right? We'll see that in a second. And so here we can see, we can feel pretty safe about the upstream market on the next one. That is the price of West Texas Intermediate, I think. And on the domestic oil cost, it's an average that the EIA puts out. The red is the oil cost, and the blue is the United States rig count. And so the U.S. rig counts have responded to the prices. So we're not leading, right? And then they flattened out after the oil prices flattened out, and we've been stable for about 2 years. So we can be pretty sure, right, that there's not the same particular brain stupidity as we saw in the early 80s. Prices have leveled out, rigs have leveled out, everything's been stable. And yet, the rest of our growth is continuing to happen. And then the top graph here shows the collapse in natural gas prices along with the collapse in the natural gas rig. And then the bottom side, the blue shows the collapse in natural gas rigs, and in the red shows our continuing increases in natural gas output. So this is the sea change that is really affecting the upstream market. We're going to see that most of this construction in the upstream market is for natural gas and extremely light liquids, which are called condensates, and then sometimes light oil. The definitions get fuzzy around there. And they're all associated in a field that you're going to find natural gas, you're generally going to find light liquids too. Or if you're looking for light liquids, which is actually what's going on, sorry, you're going to find some natural gas too. And then this upstream, this change, right, has developed fields all across the United States. Most of which, or a lot of which, are new fields or old and abandoned fields. Right? So the original oil capital of the United States, way back in 1900, whatever, before the Spindletop was actually up there in Pennsylvania. So we've known that field, right? And that field has been producing for 100-odd years, right? But output has been pretty low, right? They've still got some pumping jacks like what you would have gone out to West Texas 15 years ago or 20 years ago, and you just see the pumping jacks out there. Right? But now we've developed this newer field in larger areas than just in western Pennsylvania, right? And down throughout the south, and then all through Texas, and then up in the eastern Rockies. And so then these new fields, in order to capture the petroleum from the new fields, we have to build a pipeline, right? Or a rail tunnel. And so then that is going to be what's driving the growth in the midstream market. Now, hydrocarbons, right? So here's just a little primer on hydrocarbons. They use some metric called the API, the American Petroleum Institute gravity. Right? It has no units, but they often call it degrees. So a very low number is very heavy crude. And if you keep going low and you go negative, I think it becomes coal eventually. They don't use API numbers anymore once you get to coal. Or at least I couldn't find anywhere that you know that they do. And as you get up to higher and higher API numbers, then you start going through light liquids, or you go through oil and crude to what's called natural gasoline, right, which is part of what this condensate is, to natural gas liquids, which is things like propane, butane, and ethane. And then the lightest of all the petroleum type products is methane, which is natural gas. And so methane is just CH4, one carbon atom, 4 hydrogen atoms. And then as you go down in the API scale, you end up having more carbon atoms to hydrogen atoms, which makes them harder to break apart because chemistry. And so that what has happened here is now that these shale oil plays are in the extremely light liquid stage. So here, light crude is anything greater than 31.1. Condensate is anything greater than 50 or 45 or a number around there, which is not really standardized yet. Okay? And if you look at, these are the API numbers developed by Drilling Info for the Eagle Ford Shale. And so that even the heaviest crude that you can get is a very light liquid. It's very light crude oil. And then as you move around this field, the distribution of the petroleum products and natural gas shifts. Right? And then also, right, if you drill a hole somewhere that it says that it's going to be light crude, right, you're also going to get condensate and you're going to get the heavier, right? It has a mix of all of these carbon and hydrogen atoms in it, right? And so all of the associated and nearby oils and gas, and that's what we do here in Houston is we then separate them. Right? Once they get them to Houston, they get a light crude here, then we separate them to the distinct and different types of carbon and hydrogen atoms, right? Or hydrocarbons. And anyways, the key here is that we're getting a lot of light crude and a lot of condensate, which is this natural gas, gasoline, or natural gas liquids. And then we're getting a lot of natural gas out of these wells. Right? So in upstream, really the upstream has not been directly driving the economy for the past 2 or 3 years. The rig counts have been stable, right? So it's not our next coming out of Houston and going out to San Antonio or the Permian Basin or up to North Dakota, although there's been plenty of that too. That has been driving our growth. Some of it has been indirectly driven by the upstream because we've been producing productivity. Per rig that we have out there drilling wells, right, we've been able to drill more wells, which means that our service and materials providers have to provide these rigs with more pipe and more bits and more whatever chemicals they put in them, fracking fluid, and all of these other things that allow the rigs to continue to run, a lot of which is sourced out of Houston. Right? And so we have been indirectly driven by the upstream market. Okay. And a big part of this here is that we've essentially are no longer importing light crude. I think that the EIA is now saying that it will actually get to zero in either 2016 or 2017. And then we still import heavy crude from Venezuela, Nigeria, and Saudi Arabia, and hopefully, right, in Canada will take over some of that eventually with the Houston. We will essentially stop importing into the United States light crude by the next couple of years. All right, these new fields that we've been able to access are driving our midstream development because now we need pipelines to go to the Eagle Ford Shale and to the Dakota. Right? And so that even if it's out there in another state as far away as North Dakota, right, it's still often our companies and our workers from the Houston area that are going up there and building the rigs. Right? I have a friend who sells filters. I think his last 3 trips were to Halifax in Nova Scotia and up to the North Sea and then San Antonio. We go to San Antonio last year. And so these new fields, these new pipelines and new rail terminals, right, and most of these are our companies building their headquarters here in Houston and housing their back office support staff here in Houston. And then this light crude and natural gas, Houston had developed so that it could primarily process heavy crude because that's where the higher margins were. Normally, the heavier the crude is, the cheaper it is because it's more difficult to process it, but you can get more of the different end products out of it. And so there ends up being an higher margin, and we had the skills and the know-how to build these types of refineries. But now that the revolution is bringing us all these light crudes and condensate and stuff like that, well, we have to build a whole new set of plants to take care of the heavy, right? We're taking care of the heavy crude. Now we have to build a whole new set of plants to do something with the light crude and the condensate and the natural gas. And so that is essentially describing the upstream food. The downstream food.